The Arizona mountains held their breath in the pre-dawn darkness, a cold that bit through skin and settled in bones. Ayana's fingers, stiff from the October chill, wove dried pine branches through the makeshift frame she'd built against a cluster of red rocks. Each movement was deliberate, practiced. She'd built dozens of these shelters over the past 3 months, never staying in one place longer than a week. Her breath formed small clouds in the thin mountain air as she worked. 19 years old, but carrying the weight of someone much older. The scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline caught the faint starlight, a reminder of the night that had sent her running from the reservation. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "The land remembers, child. Trust the earth, trust the wind, trust the stars. People forget who they are supposed to be." Below her, perhaps half a mile down the slope, warm yellow light glowed from the windows of a ranch house. She'd been watching it for 3 days now, noting the patterns. One man, alone, no visitors, no dogs. He rose before dawn to tend cattle, returned at sunset, and the light died early. Perfect for what she needed, access to the stream that ran through his property, the only reliable water source for miles. Sam Mackenzie stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug warming his calloused hands, watching the mountain slopes where he'd seen the smoke. 3 days of thin grey wisps, too controlled to be accidental, too small to be a real fire. Someone was up there, camping rough. Probably another drifter heading west, though most took the easier routes through the valley. At 45, Sam had learned to mind his own business. 5 years since Martha's death had taught him that solitude was safer than hope, that an empty house couldn't break your heart twice. His ranch sat on the edge of what had once been Apache territory. Still was, according to the old-timers in town who remembered when the government first drew lines on maps that meant nothing to the people who'd lived here for generations. The coffee tasted bitter, but everything did these days. He set the mug down and reached for his coat. The cattle needed checking, and the weather looked like it might turn. Winter came early this high up, and came hard. Ayana froze at the sound of hoofbeats. Through the gaps in her shelter, she watched the rider pick his way up the game trail that ran past her camp. He was still a quarter-mile away, but she could see him clearly in the growing light. A tall man on a bay horse, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew the land well. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd chosen this spot carefully, hidden among the rocks and trees, invisible from the main trails. But this wasn't a main trail. This was a path that hunters used, that someone familiar with the mountain would know. The rider stopped just below her position, his horse dancing sideways as something spooked it. She held her breath, pressing herself deeper into the shadows of her shelter. Then she saw what had startled the horse, the thin line of smoke from her carefully banked fire, nearly invisible but carrying the scent of burning juniper wood. Sam studied the smoke, then the rocky outcrop above him. Apache country, this had been. His grandfather had told stories of the people who'd lived here, how they could disappear into landscape that seemed to offer no hiding place, how they could read the land like a book written in their own language. "I know you're up there," he called softly, his voice carrying in the still air. "I'm not looking for trouble. Water's free to anyone who needs it. Stream runs clear down by the cottonwoods." He waited, listening to the silence that followed. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the mountain, leaving the mystery unsolved but the invitation clear. Ayana watched him go, her body shaking with more than cold. His words had been spoken in English, but something in his tone reminded her of her grandfather's voice, respectful, careful, acknowledging her presence without demanding her surrender. That night, she made her way down to the stream. The water was cold and clean, tasting of snow and stone. She filled her water skins quickly, efficiently, always listening for sounds that didn't belong. As she turned to leave, she noticed something that made her pause. A small pile of supplies sat on a flat rock near the water's edge. Jerky wrapped in cloth, a tin of coffee, a box of matches. No note, no demand for gratitude or contact, just supplies left where someone who needed them would find them. Ayana stared at the offering for a long moment. Every instinct told her to leave it untouched. Gifts came with obligations, and obligations led to betrayal. But the nights were getting colder, and her own supplies were running low. She took the jerky and matches, leaving the coffee. It felt like the beginning of something she wasn't sure she was ready for. But the alternative, the long, cold road to nowhere, seemed suddenly more frightening than the risk of trust. The first snow came 2 weeks later, dusting the mountains with a crystalline warning of the winter to come. Ayana's shelter, reinforced with rocks and additional branches, held against the wind, but couldn't hold the warmth. She woke to find frost on the inside of her makeshift walls, her breath visible in the grey pre-dawn light. From her hidden camp, she watched the rancher's morning routine. Sam Mackenzie moved through his chores with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd spent years perfecting solitude. Feed the cattle, check the water troughs, mend fence where the wind had loosened wire. He worked alone, spoke to no one but his horse, and seemed content in the isolation that would have driven most men to madness. But Ayana had learned to read the subtle signs of human distress. The way his shoulders carried tension, the pause in his movements when he thought no one was watching, the careful way he avoided looking toward the small cemetery plot behind his house, where a single headstone stood among the dried wildflowers. The supplies continued to appear by the stream. Never the same thing twice, never more than what a person might reasonably need. Dried fruit, tinned meat, a wool blanket that smelled of cedar and something else, something that might have been loneliness, though she couldn't be sure. She began leaving things in return, a handful of pine nuts roasted over her small fire, wild herbs that her grandmother had taught her to identify, bundled and dried. Small stones arranged in patterns that meant gratitude in the old language, though she doubted he would understand their significance. Sam found the pine nuts on a morning when the wind carried the promise of serious weather. He studied them carefully, recognizing the careful way they'd been prepared, the knowledge that went into selecting and roasting them properly. His grandfather had eaten pine nuts, had learned their preparation from Apache friends during the brief peaceful times before the government decided such friendships were inconvenient. The herbs puzzled him until he asked old Tom Brennan at the general store in town. Tom's weathered face had creased into a knowing smile. "That's sacred datura and desert sage," Tom had said, handling the bundles with surprising reverence. "Apache medicine. Someone saying thank you in a language older than this territory." "Someone's up in the mountains," Sam had replied carefully. "Been leaving supplies." Tom's eyes had sharpened. "You be careful, Sam. Lot of bad feelings still. Lot of people think the only good Apache is—" "I know what people think," Sam had cut him off. "I also know what's right." The conversation had stayed with him as he rode back to the ranch. The territory had a long, bloody history. Massacres on both sides, broken treaties, children torn from families and sent to schools that tried to kill everything that made them who they were. He'd grown up hearing stories that painted the Apache as savage, inhuman, but his grandfather had told different stories, of honor, of connection to the land, of a people fighting to survive the destruction of their entire world. That night, he left a different kind of gift by the stream. A book, worn soft from handling, its pages yellowed with age. Apache Legends of the Southwest, collected and translated by ethnologist James Mooney. Inside the front cover, he'd written in careful script, "For someone who might remember what we've forgotten." Ayana found the book at dawn, her hands shaking as she opened it. The stories were familiar. She'd heard many of them from her grandmother, though these versions had been filtered through white understanding, some of the power lost in translation. But the intent behind the gift was clear. This wasn't charity or pity. This was recognition. That afternoon, she made a decision that terrified her. She left her shelter and walked down to the stream in broad daylight, knowing he would be working near the lower pasture, knowing he would see her. Sam looked up from the fence post he was setting to see a figure standing by the cottonwoods. She was small, perhaps 5 feet tall, with black hair that fell past her shoulders and skin the color of burnished copper. Even at a distance, he could see the wariness in her posture, the way she held herself ready to run. He set down his tools and walked slowly toward the stream, stopping when he was still 20 feet away. Close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to respect her obvious need for space. "Thank you," she said in English, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone speaking a second language. "For the book. For understanding." "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then lifted her chin with a pride that reminded him of his grandmother's stories about Apache warriors. "Ayana. It means eternal blossom in my language. I'm Sam Mackenzie. This is my land, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Land doesn't really belong to anyone, does it? We just take care of it for a while." Something flickered in her dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the beginning of something that might eventually become trust. "You speak like my grandfather did. He said the white man's words could be true, if the heart behind them was true. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man." He was. Her voice carried a weight of loss that Sam recognized. "He died 3 years ago, on the reservation, said he was tired of being caged." They stood in silence for a moment. Two people separated by culture and history, but united by grief and solitude. Then Ayana turned and walked back toward the mountains, leaving Sam standing by the stream with the sound of her voice echoing in the autumn air. That night, she didn't return to her shelter among the rocks. Instead, she built a small fire closer to the stream, visible from the ranch house. It was a statement, a tentative step towards something that might be trust, or might be the beginning of another kind of disaster. Sam saw the fire from his kitchen window and poured himself a second cup of coffee. For the first time in 5 years, his empty house felt a little less empty. The storm hit on a Tuesday night with the violence that only mountain weather could deliver. Ayana woke to her shelter shuddering under 60-mile-per-hour winds, the carefully woven branches groaning and beginning to separate. Snow drove horizontally through the gaps in her walls, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. She had perhaps 30 minutes before the shelter collapsed completely. Her emergency supplies, what little she had, were cached in 3 different locations, none of them reachable in this weather. The choice was simple: go down to the ranch house and ask for help, or face the storm with nothing but the clothes on her back and the very real possibility of freezing to death. Sam was splitting wood in his barn when he heard the sound, a rhythmic knocking that cut through the howl of the wind. He set down his axe and walked to the door, knowing before he opened it what he would find. Ayana stood on his porch, snow-covered and shivering, her dark hair whipping around her face. She'd lost her hat somewhere in the journey down the mountain, and her lips were blue with cold. But her eyes were steady, meeting his without flinching. "My shelter's gone," she said simply. "I have nowhere else to go." Sam stepped aside, gesturing her into the warmth of his home. "Come in, get warm." She hesitated at the threshold, her body language screaming conflict. Every instinct told her to run, but the wind at her back made running impossible. She stepped inside, and Sam closed the door against the storm. The house was larger than it had seemed from a distance, but Sam had clearly been living in only a few rooms. The kitchen was warm and well used, with a wood stove that radiated heat and the lingering scent of coffee and honest work. But the other rooms she could see, a parlor, a dining room, were closed off, furniture covered with sheets like ghosts of a different life. "Sit," Sam said, indicating a chair by the stove. "I'll get you some dry clothes." He returned with a flannel shirt and wool pants that had clearly belonged to a woman. The shirt still smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something that spoke of love and loss and careful preservation. "My wife's," he said simply, seeing her hesitation. "She'd want them to be useful." Ayana took the clothes with hands that were finally beginning to warm. "I'll return them when the storm passes. Keep them." She had more clothes than one person could wear. His voice carried a grief that had settled into acceptance, the kind of pain that had learned to coexist with daily life. While she changed in the small washroom, Sam made soup from canned beef and vegetables, adding spices that his wife had taught him to use. When Ayana emerged, transformed by dry clothes and warmth, he was struck by how young she looked and how old her eyes were. They ate in comfortable silence, the storm raging outside, but held at bay by solid walls and human company. It was Ayana who finally spoke. "Why didn't you turn me in?" she asked. "There are people in town who would pay good money to know where I am." Sam set down his spoon, considering his answer. "My grandfather used to say that a man's character is measured by how he treats those who can do nothing for him. You never did me any harm. Seemed wrong to do you any." "Your grandfather sounds like he was a good man." "He was, fought in the Apache wars, but he never talked about it with pride. Said there was no honor in destroying people who were just trying to protect their families." Ayana studied his face, reading the sincerity there. "Most white men I've met don't think that way." "Most white men haven't lost everything they cared about," Sam replied. "Makes you think differently about what really matters." Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside the kitchen, something fragile was being built. Not trust, that would take time, but the possibility of trust. The recognition that two damaged people might find in each other something they'd both thought was lost forever. "I can sleep in the barn," Ayana offered. "When the storm passes, I'll go." Sam shook his head. "Martha's sewing room has a bed. Door locks from the inside, if that makes you feel safer." The offer hung between them, weighted with implications. A room with a lock meant privacy, safety, the ability to leave if she chose. But it also meant staying, accepting hospitality that came with no strings attached, trusting that his words meant what they appeared to mean. "The door doesn't need to lock," she said finally. "If you meant me harm, you would have done it already." Sam showed her to the small room off the kitchen, where a narrow bed was covered with a quilt that showed the careful work of loving hands. The window looked out toward the mountains, toward the territory that had once been home to her people. "The storm should pass by morning," he said. "You can decide what you want to do then." But as Ayana lay in the narrow bed, listening to the wind begin to die and the house settle into quiet, she realized that for the first time in months, she felt safe. Not just physically safe, but safe in a way that went deeper. Safe enough to sleep without listening for footsteps, safe enough to trust that morning would bring choices rather than consequences. In his own room down the hall, Sam lay awake, listening to the small sounds of another person in his house. The soft whisper of breath, the quiet shifting of someone finding comfortable sleep. It had been 5 years since he'd heard such sounds, and he'd forgotten how they could make a house feel like a home. The storm passed in the early hours of morning, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. But inside the ranch house, something more significant had changed. Two people who had been running from the world had found in each other a reason to stop running. The morning brought crystalline silence and 3 feet of snow, transforming the landscape into something that belonged more to dreams than to the harsh reality of mountain life. Ayana woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, sounds from the kitchen that spoke of routine and normalcy, things she'd almost forgotten existed. Sam was standing at the stove when she appeared in the doorway, wearing Martha's flannel shirt and the careful expression of someone still deciding whether to stay or run. "Coffee?" he offered, as if having a fugitive Apache woman in his kitchen was the most natural thing in the world. She nodded, accepting the mug with hands that were steadier than they'd been in months. The coffee was strong and black, the way her grandfather had taught her to drink it during the long winters when sugar was scarce and survival was the only sweetener they needed. "The snow's too deep for travel," Sam said, stating the obvious without making it sound like a trap. "Roads won't be passable for days, maybe weeks." Ayana looked out the window at the pristine white world, beautiful and imprisoning in equal measure. "I've survived worse winters." "I'm sure you have, but you don't have to." The words hung between them, weighted with possibility and risk. Staying meant accepting help, acknowledging need, opening herself to the kind of vulnerability that had nearly destroyed her before. But leaving meant returning to the half-life she'd been living, the constant running that had worn her down to nothing but instinct and fear. "I can work," she said finally. "I'm not looking for charity." Sam smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "I figured as much. Ranch always needs work, and I've been doing it alone for too long." They spent the morning in careful negotiation, two people learning to trust by degrees. Ayana would help with the animals, the cooking, the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. In return, she would have a place to sleep, food to eat, and the protection of Sam's reputation in a territory where her presence would be dangerous if discovered. It was a practical arrangement, but underneath the practical lay something more complex. Sam had been slowly dying of loneliness, and Ayana had been slowly dying of fear. Together, they might find a way to live. The first test came 3 days later, when Tom Brennan arrived with supplies and news from town. Ayana heard the horse approaching and melted into the shadows of the barn, watching through a crack in the wood as the old man dismounted and walked toward the house. "Sam!" Tom called out, his voice carrying the urgency of someone with important news. "You need to hear this." Sam emerged from the kitchen, his face carefully neutral. "What's the trouble, Tom?" "Sheriff's got word there's an Apache girl missing from the reservation. Dangerous, they say. Attacked a government official before she ran." Tom's weathered face was grim. "Territorial governors put a bounty on her head, $500. In the barn, Ayana's blood turned to ice. The lie was carefully constructed, designed to turn her from a runaway into a violent criminal. She'd never attacked anyone. Her crime had been simpler and more complex. She'd witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see, and she'd refused to stay silent about it. $500, Sam repeated, his voice giving nothing away. "That's a lot of money." "It is, indeed. Could solve a lot of problems for a man in your position." Tom's eyes were sharp, studying Sam's face. "You seen any sign of strangers around here?" Sam was quiet for a long moment, and Ayana held her breath. $500 was more money than most people in the territory saw in a year, enough to save a struggling ranch, to pay off debts, to buy security and comfort. "Haven't seen anyone," Sam said finally. "But I'll keep my eyes open." Tom nodded, satisfied. "You be careful, Sam. Indian or not, someone dangerous enough to have a bounty on their head isn't someone you want to tangle with." After Tom left, Sam found Ayana in the barn, sitting in the hay with her knees pulled to her chest. She looked up when he entered, her dark eyes reflecting a pain that went deeper than fear. "I never attacked anyone," she said quietly. "What I did was tell the truth about what I saw. Apparently, that was attack enough." Sam sat down beside her, careful not to get too close. "What did you see?" She was quiet for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she told him about the night that had changed everything. About the Indian agent who'd been selling reservation supplies for profit, leaving families to starve. About the young Apache man who'd confronted him, demanding food for his sick child. About the agent's response, a bullet fired in panic, a boy dead in the dust, and the story that followed, another dangerous Apache put down in self-defense. "I was there," she said. "I saw what really happened. When I tried to tell the truth, they said I was lying." Said I was a troublemaker who needed to be taught a lesson. Her hand moved unconsciously to the scar on her face. They taught me, all right. Taught me that truth is dangerous when it threatens comfortable lies. Sam felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same rage that had filled him when he'd first heard about the massacre at Wounded Knee, about the boarding schools that tried to kill the Indian in children, about the systematic destruction of a people and their way of life. $500, he said, his voice heavy with irony. Your life's worth $500 to them. My silence was worth more, Ayanna replied. But I couldn't give them that. They sat in the barn as the afternoon light faded, two people bound together by their shared understanding of what it meant to be trapped by other people's lies. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them into a world where the only truth that mattered was the one they created together. You can stay, Sam said finally, as long as you need to, as long as you want to. The bounty is for a dangerous criminal who doesn't exist. Far as I know, there's no one here but me and Martha's ghost. Ayanna looked at him, seeing past the careful words to the man beneath. He was offering her more than shelter. He was offering her a chance to be human again, to exist as something other than a fugitive defined by other people's hatred. Why? She asked. Why risk everything for someone you barely know? Sam was quiet for a moment, thinking of Martha, of the love they'd shared and lost, of the empty years that had followed. Because, he said finally, I think we're both tired of being alone. That night, they ate dinner together at the kitchen table, no longer strangers sharing necessity, but two people beginning to build something that might, eventually, be called home. Spring came late to the Arizona mountains, arriving in tentative steps rather than bold declarations. The snow retreated grudgingly, leaving behind a world washed clean and full of possibility. Ayanna had been at the ranch for 4 months, and the careful distance she'd maintained had gradually given way to something more complex, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared solitude. She'd learned the rhythms of ranch life, the pre-dawn feeding, the careful management of water and grazing, the endless maintenance that kept civilization functioning in the wilderness. Sam had learned the deeper rhythms of the land, which plants warned of changing weather, how to read the behavior of wild animals, the Apache understanding of balance that his own culture had forgotten. But it was the small intimacies that had truly changed them. The way Ayanna hummed while she worked, songs in a language Sam didn't understand but somehow recognized. The way Sam left her coffee exactly the way she liked it, without being asked. The comfortable silences that had replaced the careful conversations of winter. The test came on a warm April morning when riders appeared on the horizon, 3 men moving with the deliberate purpose of law enforcement. Ayanna saw them first, her body tensing with the old instincts of flight and concealment. "Sam!" she called from the window. "Riders coming." He joined her at the window, his face grim as he recognized the lead rider. Sheriff Bill Morrison, a man who'd made his reputation hunting down troublemakers and who'd never been particular about whether the law was on his side. "Go to the root cellar," Sam said quietly. "Stay there until they're gone." "What if they search?" "They won't. I'll make sure of it." Ayanna looked at him, seeing the set of his shoulders, the way he'd positioned himself between her and the approaching threat. "Sam, if they find me here, they'll hang you along with me. Then we better make sure they don't find you." She wanted to argue, to insist that he let her run, that he not risk himself for her safety. But there was something in his eyes that stopped her, a quiet determination that spoke of decisions made and accepted. The root cellar was dark and cool, smelling of earth and the vegetables they'd stored for winter. Ayanna crouched in the shadows, listening to the sound of horses in the yard, boots on the porch, voices raised in the careful politeness of men who didn't trust each other. "Mackenzie," she heard Sheriff Morrison say, "mind if we come in? Got some questions to ask." "Course not," Sam replied, his voice carrying the easy courtesy of a man with nothing to hide. "Coffee's on if you want some." They came into the kitchen, their spurs ringing on the wooden floor. Ayana could hear them moving around, the subtle sounds of men searching without seeming to search. "Nice place you got here," Morrison said. "Quiet, peaceful. Must get lonely sometimes." "I like the quiet," Sam replied. "Had enough noise to last me a lifetime." "I bet you have. Heard you were at Antietam." I was. The conversation continued, casual and dangerous, while Ayana held her breath in the darkness below. She could feel the weight of the house above her, the presence of the men who hunted her, the steady heartbeat of the man who stood between her and destruction. "Thing is," Morrison was saying, "we got word there might be a dangerous Apache in these parts. Girl who killed a government official. You seen anything like that?" "Haven't seen anyone," Sam said, his voice unchanged. "Like I said, I keep to myself." "Course you do, but $500 is a lot of money. Could help a man get back on his feet, buy some new stock, maybe fix up this place." The silence stretched, and Ayana knew this was the moment of choice. $500 against whatever loyalty he felt to a woman he'd known for 4 months. Practical considerations against something more ephemeral and dangerous. "It is a lot of money," Sam agreed, "but I haven't seen anyone to collect it on." Morrison's voice carried a note of frustration. "You sure about that? Because we got reports of smoke in these mountains, signs of someone camping rough, someone who knows the land, knows how to hide." "Could be hunters," Sam suggested, "or drifters heading west. Lot of people passing through these days." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, Morrison probing and Sam deflecting with the skill of a man who'd learned to guard his words. Finally, the sheriff and his men left, their horses disappearing into the distance with the sound of frustrated authority. Sam waited until they were completely gone before opening the cellar door. Ayana emerged, blinking into the sunlight, her face pale but determined. "They'll be back," she said. "Morrison's not the type to give up easily." "Probably," Sam agreed, "but not for a while. And when they do come back, we'll be ready." "We?" Sam looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the fugitive Apache woman, but the person she'd become in his kitchen, his barn, his life. "Ayana, I've been alone for 5 years. I'd forgotten what it was like to have someone to talk to share the work with, to care about. I'm not giving that up. Not for Morrison, not for $500, not for anything." She stared at him, seeing the truth in his eyes. "You know what they'll do to you if they find out you've been harboring me." "I know what they'll do to me if I let them take you," he replied, "and I know which one I can live with." That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, the sky painted in shades of gold and crimson. The spring air was warm, carrying the scent of new grass and the promise of easier times ahead. "I used to think home was a place," Ayana said quietly. "The reservation, the traditional lands, somewhere my people belonged. But I've been thinking, maybe home is just wherever you don't have to be afraid." Sam nodded, understanding. "Martha used to say that home was wherever you could be yourself without apology." "Your Martha sounds like she was wise." "She was. I think she would have liked you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the sound was answered from across the valley. "Sam," Ayana said finally, "I want to stay, not just until the heat dies down, not just until I figure out where to go next. I want to stay." He turned to look at her, seeing the woman who'd learned to trust again, who'd found the courage to stop running. "This place, it's not much, just a small ranch in the middle of nowhere." "It's not nowhere," she replied. "It's where I learned that walls don't have to be prisons, where I learned that some people keep their word, where I learned that home isn't about where you come from, it's about where you choose to be." Sam reached out and took her hand, feeling the calluses from months of shared work, the strength that had carried her through survival and beyond. "Then stay," he said simply. "Stay, and help me remember what it's like to be alive." Ooh. As the stars brightened overhead, Ayana felt the last of her fear finally begin to fade. She'd built so many shelters of branches and desperation, so many temporary refugees from a world that wanted to destroy her. But here, in this place where a lonely rancher had offered walls without locks, she'd found something better than shelter. She'd found home. The Apache girl who'd fled into the mountains in terror and desperation was gone, replaced by a woman who'd learned to trust again, to love again, to believe in the possibility of belonging. And the lonely rancher who'd been slowly dying of isolation had found, in her courage and her choice to stay, a reason to live again. Outside, the coyotes called to each other across the valley, their voices carrying messages of companionship and hope. Inside the ranch house, two people who'd been running from the world had finally found the place where they could stop running and start building something new. Something that looked, for the first time in either of their lives, like happiness.